A couple of years ago, Naomi Klein published a book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It is a book that really rattled the intellectual cage of what counts as the left in American politics. The basic thesis is that governments and corporate interests use disasters, either natural or man-made disasters, as opportunities to re-engineer societies in ways those societies would otherwise resist. So after the hurricane, perfectly inhabitable, undamaged public housing must be torn down. After the military invasion and the toppling of the government, the oil fields must be open to foreign oil companies. After the tsunami, those wrecked fishing villages should become private beaches owned by the developers of resorts. Don't you want to know what the author of Shock Doctrine thinks about the bailout right now? And all of its how are they getting away with this glory? Joining us now is Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. She's a columnist for The Nation magazine. Naomi, it's really nice to have you here in person. Thanks for coming in.
So glad to be here, Rachel.
On the eve of the stress test results for the financial industry, which are expected to show that a lot of the banks are sort of fine now-ish, I think a lot of Americans are going to be torn between being livid about the bailout, livid about all the tax dollars that went to Wall Street, but also sort of happy that maybe it's working. We still have a banking system. How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, it still feels like they're playing with the numbers, that they're trying to delay the moment of truth, and I think that that's why that confidence is really, really tentative. And there's still, I think that when we look at the bailout that started under Paulson and now is being continued under Geithner, you really see an absolutely seamless approach, and it was bipartisan under Bush. It was, the Democrats standing together with Republicans to sell this thing. And there hasn't really been a shift. And I think it really does fit the thesis of the shock doctrine because, in New Orleans, it was the public housing that was handed over to developers after the shock of the flooding of the city. Here we have just this transfer, this massive transfer of public wealth into private hands, and that's continuing, and it's much, much larger. It's just on a much larger scale than any of the investments in the public sphere that we're seeing through the stimulus package or the budget. I mean, it's $11.5 trillion to bail out the financial sector, and it's less than $1 trillion to stimulate the economy, and a lot of that is tax cuts. So even if it is working, and I do think it even if we look at Bank of America and the response to the fact that they're short $30+ billion, it's just to play with the numbers. That's not the kind of thing that actually instills confidence. My real concern, it's been my concern from day one, is that the crisis on Wall Street created by deregulated capitalism is not actually being solved. It's being moved. A private sector crisis is being turned into a public sector crisis. So all of this mismanagement in the bailout, and even if it does work by propping up these banks,
it's still a public sector liability.
Budgetary, right. And so who pays for this? And we've seen some of that in, I think, the scale of the stimulus package. It's smaller than it should be if we believe people like Paul Krugman. He thinks it needs to be 3 times as large. We've seen, and you've talked about this extensively on the show, why isn't there more on public transit? So they're already cutting corners. And now we're seeing things like AIDS funding, in Africa being cut by $6.6 billion. So who's paying for this? And this is where I think the unfairness of it really becomes very clear, that it is a bailout, but it's the very poorest and most vulnerable and weakest people in the world who are being asked to bail out the wealthiest and most powerful.
And in Shock Doctrine, you talk about the impunity of the elites, and I guess this fits that as well. If the crisis in unregulated financial markets, unregulated capitalism of this specific kind that caused this specific crisis, if the cost of that would have been borne by the people who are players in that part of the financial world, those are the elites. And so their impunity, not only in terms of being blamed, but also in terms of absorbing their own risks, is something that they should never be expected to have to endure that. It gets put off on others.
Exactly. And actually, this is something that's happened again over and over again in the history of this economic model, which takes away the rules and says, have a free-for-all. It is a crisis creation machine, and we've seen this in other parts of the world. And the U.S. has sort of deferred this crisis by deferring it to other locations, but I track it in the book, starting in Chile, where you had the first experiment in this Wild West form of capitalism in the 70s, and it ended with Pinochet having to nationalize the banks because they had accumulated so much debt. So really all that's different here is, one, that it's come home, and two, the scale. I mean, the scale is absolutely unprecedented. And I do believe, I hate to say this if people are feeling a little bit optimistic, that I really do think this will go down, the bailout will go down as the greatest heist in monetary history. And I don't see, I like a lot of the things that the Obama administration is doing, but what worries me is this idea that you can be Keynesian, when it comes to the stimulus package, but you can maintain this edifice of crony capitalism in the financial sector, and you can have these two tracks that are completely different, when really what we would optimally need in a moment of crisis like this is a banking sector that was working hand in hand with the priorities, the social priorities,
right.
So that it would be helping homeowners, not having public money go to lobbyists to successfully defeat measures that would help those homeowners. So we have all of these contradictions because of this idea that you can keep the market happy by throwing it more of what it wants, which is frankly crony capitalism, which is more handouts, no strings attached. But yes, we can also invest in the real economy, and the scale of the bailout is too large for that to actually happen.
Yeah, and even if we're just looking for mitigating factors, the re-regulation of Wall Street, which they keep promising, still to come, still to hope for, but not going hand in hand with the bailout money. It's the bailout money all comes first, and the re-regulation comes thereafter.
But this is shocking. I mean, this is really shocking. If you think about FDR, he used the public anger, the rage at these CEOs not paying taxes, the rage at the double standards, and got Glass-Steagall, the law that prevented investment banks from also being commercial banks, 2 days after those shocking revelations came out in the Pecora. He didn't wait. So, what I worry about is that there is all this free-floating rage. If it isn't channeled constructively into that re-regulation, if the money that's being given to the financial sector isn't tied to that restructuring, then what's going to happen with the rage? And one, and it gets channeled somewhere, immigrants, whoever. But then we also haven't used the leverage, right? I mean, if the international, I would say, the International Monetary Fund is a great example of this. When countries are broke, they need a loan from the IMF. They go to the IMF. They say, bail us out. We're in trouble. And the IMF says, sure, we'll bail you out. But here's a list of things that you have to do to get the money. It's called structural adjustment.
We could be an IMF for Wall Street right now.
Exactly.
Naomi Klein, I could talk to you all evening. I hope you'll come back.
I would love to. Thank you, Rachel.
Naomi Klein is the author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, one of the most influential thinkers anywhere over the last 10 years. It's sort of mandatory reading. The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism.